So, welcome to the first episode of the Horizons Review. I'm Kyle Housley. The idea behind this podcast is to discuss great ideas, primarily by anchoring our discussion to particular books or essays. But I won't rule out films or poems in the future as well. With me is my friend Cody Moser, who will be a regular co host of the show. Our plan is to do one episode a month with each other, but I'm also lining up other guests for more episodes. And I haven't ruled out solo episodes, but I think that's somewhat unlikely. I would like to hit an every other week cadence at some point for this. Anyhow, Cody, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Cody Moser. I'm finishing my PhD at UC Merced. I study how collectives gain meaning, how they produce different kinds of knowledge systems, and just really excited to talk about some of these things with Kyle, who has a lot of really good ideas. I think this podcast will be really exciting for him getting those out more.
So today we're going to be talking about John Henry Newman's essay, An Aid of Grammar of Assent. We'll just call it the essay from here on, because it's kind of a mouthful.
Yeah.
But Newman was an Anglican priest and scholar who was one of the major figures in what was called the Oxford movement, which was a sort of reform movement within Anglicanism, which led to what's today called Anglo-Catholicism. Newman himself, however, converted to the Roman Catholic Church, where he eventually became a cardinal. And more recently, Newman has been made a saint and doctor by the Roman Church. I'd like to start each episode with a pitch for why you should read this work or why it's interesting. I'll make the initial pitch here because it's my fault that Cody has read this book in the first place. And for me, the essay is one of the most interesting works of epistemology and on the phenomenology of ideas that's ever been written. Newman doesn't just draw subtle distinctions between the different modes in which we hold propositions, but he also makes a broader case about what rationality actually is that doesn't reduce it to logical deduction. And while the work is also a work of Christian and specifically Catholic apologetics, you don't have to be convinced by any of Newman's specifically religious arguments to derive benefit from the essay. And we will mostly not be discussing the apologetic arguments in this podcast, except for the broader question of whether religious belief itself can be considered rational. Another great reason to read the essay, though, is that Newman is simply one of the greatest writers of English prose who's ever lived. This is probably his driest book by a wide margin, and still every few paragraphs, there's some passage of luminous prose. So if you're in love with the English language to any degree, Newman is a great pleasure to read. Cody, do you have anything to add about why people should maybe read this book?
Yeah, I mean, on my end, I really hadn't read much Newman until you came out and visited me. I was doing this fellowship at UCLA's Institute for Pure and Applied Math, where we're trying to deduce different mathematical frameworks of intelligence, reasoning, so on and so forth between AI, humans, animals. And you talk quite a bit about Newman's essay, and it really inspired me because hearing you talk and then later reading the book, I realized that in terms of the many texts on philosophy of mind that you could come across or that I've read, Newman's really seems to anticipate a lot of arguments that I think are at the forefront of cognitive science now. One thing that's interesting is a lot of his work here gets into Bayesian reasoning, how he thinks that the mind works through some kind of Bayesian probabilistic process. He talks about differences between knowledge and understanding, although he doesn't really use those terms. It predates things that Searle was talking about relevant to AI. My favorite philosopher, Michael Polanyi, most of his ideas are present in some form in this book. Virtue epistemology, he intersects with Peirce's ideas in abduction. And so just reading this, I was really blown away in what presumably, I don't really know the history so much. This book was supposed to originally be something like a Christian apologetic text, was really more of a brilliant philosophy of mind. And I think really grasp a lot of what's going on in cognitive science. It seems like Newman has already reasoned through a lot of these things. And I think this book could be of immense value, just more generally for cognitive science and philosophy of mind.
Yeah, I don't think we've discussed this, but there's actually I think there's a good insight into how he arrived at this particular book
Mm.
from the idea of like doing something apologetics, because it's something that his intellectual autobiography, the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, it's written in response to this controversy that basically he was accused of being somewhat misleading in his path to becoming Catholic, that he had maybe decided to become Catholic for quite some time and was trying to
Hmm.
mislead Anglicans about his Catholicism. Newman writes this wonderful defense. It's one of the great autobiographies of the English language, like how his religious opinions changed. And there's this passage that I think really links up to what this book is about. And it's very obvious that this passage links up to what the book is about, because quote from St. Ambrose in this passage is what he uses as the motto for this entire book. And he's talking about like sort of the moment that his mind changes and he's sort of set on becoming Roman Catholic.
Hmm.
It was then I felt altogether the force of the maxim of St. Ambrose. It was not by dialectic that it pleased God to save his people. I had a great dislike of paper logic. For myself, it was not logic that carried me on, as well as might one say that the quicksilver in the barometer changes the weather. It is the concrete being that reasons. Pass a number of years, and I find myself in a new place. How? The whole man moves. Paper logic is but the record of it. I think this is the passage where this is what leads him to like what I think is like the big idea in this book, even though it comes at the very, very end of the book, which is the concept of the elitive sense, which I think is the
Yeah.
key to the whole book. He builds to it very slowly. I think starting actually with the elitive sense is a good place to start talking about this book. So for Newman, what the elitive sense is, it's like this inner capacity that lets us arrive at the truth of propositions. And this isn't mere logical deduction. It's sort of this additive thing. Like ideas exist in context with other ideas. We're constantly adding on to them. We have experience with using them. We have reinforcement. An example I've often used with the elitive sense is like, how do you know that someone is a friend? Right? Like you can have this instant affinity with a person that you've just met. And you like know, oh,
Mm.
I have like these intellectual things in common. Like this person is polite. They seem kind. You can have all these traits and like also that ineffable sense of connection that you might have with someone that you just met. But actually arriving at the position like this person is a friend and I trust this person comes only through accumulated experience. And that is that sort of thing. And like that's a proposition. You know, so and so, Cody is my friend. Like that is a proposition that I have to, in Newman's term, assent to at some point. But we arrive at it like through this additive way, and I think what is interesting is Newman really makes the great case that it's not just true for like these sort of like more airy propositions like so and so is my friend. It's also true for theories or
Mathematics.
any sort of big idea goes through this process of the elitive sense. One common thing though, like people who have an education in philosophy have when they hear about the elitive sense, they go, well, isn't this just phronesis, like Aristotle's concept of practical wisdom? But Newman actually, in order to define the elitive sense, he actually defines it within the context of phronesis. And for him, like phronesis is this multifarious thing that for every type of art, there is a phronesis appropriate to that art. Like, so there's one of ethical judgment, there would be one of whittling, there'd be one of playing the piano, and then there's one of knowing what propositions are true or not. And that's the elitive sense. And he even divides that up as well. He says that some people have a stronger elitive sense for some matters than they have for others. And so that's like that concept, once again, it can seem very, very trite, but I do think that concept is important to forward in the book because it really is what he's leading to all along is the idea that this is the wellspring of rationality.
One thing I really like is that he has this quote where he says something like, the mind is something that reasons, logic is something that does not. So he says
Yeah.
that the elitive sense is something you gather through experience. This is where he dovetails with Bayes. It's like, I come across these things in my life. I start saying, well, it seems like this ought to be true given that. but it's not something that we are logically deducing in any given moment. It's as if the inference procedure is automatic in some, um, and then you arrive at this truth, but it doesn't proceed via logical. Well, Kyle did this and then he did that, therefore he the probability of him being a friend is like 98% or something. And so what he does is he seems to close this gap between this idea of probabilistic inference of convergence towards something and then arriving at truth, and arriving at truth and truth statements, believing that X is Y. He talks about, I think, not only X is Y, but X follows from Y. I believe that X is true because Y is true. I believe that X is true because Kyle said it's true, and so on and so forth. And he's like, these aren't simple things that you just get via logical deduction, although you can do it that way. It's really just something that the mind does. And eventually you arrive at, well, this conclusion therefore is true. I assent to it. It's not something that's so easily mapped out by people. It dovetails with Michael Polanyi's notion of tacit knowledge, where tacit knowledge is knowledge that is inarticulable by humans, right? You know the right way to tie your shoes. You can't really articulate so well, although he goes on to talk about much grander things than tying your shoes, right? But I like this notion that what happens is humans are not simply logically deducing or even simply probabilistically converging, but via these means we arrive at truths that kind of shape our cognitive ecosystems.
Yeah, I think this is a good place because like this distinction too between logical deduction and probabilistic deduction is also something that he goes into when he talks about the modes in which we hold propositions. So a large part of this book is actually taken up just by this enormous categorization of like ways in which people can hold propositions, from like the simplest thing of a child trusting their parents when they tell them something, to like accepting sort of like social facts like London is the capital of the United Kingdom, to discussing like how people hold what we would say are like big ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And the first mode that he talks about is the apprehension.
Mm.
So, which can happen in what Newman calls both a notional and a real sense. And I know, Cody, you have like some things to say about Newman's view of apprehension, so I'll let you take the lead here.
So it seems like he splits apprehension into two different forms or two different fields. One is that I can apprehend things notionally. I can say that they're true because the system in which they're operating is true, right? I can apprehend that I have translated a piece of text on some, and I love this example, it says on some, economic treatise faithfully from English into French without actually really understanding what that treatise means. On the other hand, he says that there's also real apprehension. He's like, that comes down to understanding things like causes, context, what philosophers of language would call like their pragmatic meaning, not just the associated words and the ways that they kind of cobble together. And in this section of the book where he's talking about this difference between notional and real, I found that he was effectively just describing what would later be Searle's Chinese room experiment. So in this Chinese room thought experiment, the idea is you have this, it goes back to this idea of the Turing test, which is, let's say we have a box, and what you do is you put in some kind of prompt into this box, and then it puts out some kind of input. Turing said, well, if this box is producing something that seems human enough, we might as well just call it human. We should say that this thing is intelligent in the same way that a human is. And Searle says, well, what we should do is we should try and look inside the box. We should see what procedures is the box using to generate what it's putting out. And he says, imagine that you have this room where you say, okay, I need you to translate, uh, or I have this prompt in Chinese and I need you to give me something back also in Chinese, right? And he says, a guy from China will be able to sit there and you can say, oh, how's the weather today? Is it raining? If it's raining, does that infer that it's cloudy? And the guy, if it's Chinese per room, will say, yeah, of course that infers that it's cloudy. And he'll produce the text, give it out, and he'll say, okay, it said something. On the other hand, you could just have a guy who has a dictionary with English to Chinese statements, and what it has is a lookup table. And this lookup table, you can say, okay, if X, then Y, then say Z. And what you'll produce is functionally the exact same end result of saying, yeah, if it's raining, then it's probably cloudy. But on the other hand, the guy who's inside the room can say, well, I knew that if it's raining, it's cloudy, versus using a lookup table, this AI, which is really what Searle's talking about, this artificial intelligence doesn't have that requisite understanding of this connection between rain and clouds. And so this is Newman's difference between notional apprehension, which is grasping abstract ideas and their relationship to each other. You could bring this into language and saying, he talks about grammarians oftentimes use notional assent, probably mathematicians and the like. But this real apprehension is understanding X is true because I know that the logical conditions of the statement have to be such a way. And this distinction between notional and real, I think, gets at the distinction between what Searle talks about between knowledge and understanding.
Yeah. And the next idea that he comes up with, so then there's also this function of inference. And inference is when you're able to arrive at a proposition through some accumulation of other propositions, or through a logical other propositions or experiences, or through some sort of logical deduction.
Mm-hmm.
And the first type of inference, inference where you're just arriving at it through accumulation, he calls informal inference. And the type of inference that you arrive at the end of some sort of logical process is formal inference. And I do think it's useful not just divide between these two things, because that is philosophically uncontroversial.
Mm-hmm.
It's the idea that they actually are, though, both highly similar mental acts in how we use these things. That the truths that we arrive at through probabilistic reasoning, we don't actually treat those truths that differently than the ones that we arrive at through logical reasoning. And a great thing that Newman does throughout his discussion of logical reasoning is he talks frequently about the idea that if you already hold truth, like a really deep truth, as true in your mind, all the acts of inference that lead to it somehow seem like weak or insufficient, or
Mm-hmm.
like no longer that convincing to you, like compared to the actual experience of knowing what the truth is. And in fact, like dwelling too hard on these inferences that you made to arrive at the truth can sort of like remove the truth from view, or like make it seem sort of insubstantial at the time. And I think like that is a really interesting thing about how inference works for us. It definitely seems to be true. And the thing that I think about a lot that's like really the silly version of this is the experience that everyone's had, where like sometimes like you're looking at a word, and instead of that word being a tool that you're used to, like something happens where you're just like reading it as a series of symbols, and
Right.
it feels like nonsense to you, like in that briefest moment when you go to analyze what it's versus just using it, it suddenly becomes highly unreal to you.
Yeah, so this idea of, I'm trying to grasp the distinction. So formal inference, or the types of things that you arrive at, is a type of reasoning that you would use in like a classic logico-deductive type reasoning. like if X is true, then Y, and so on and so forth, right? Um, and what he's saying is that, yeah, you can use that. You may not necessarily always be convinced by that, though. Your idea of assent, which in some ways assent is basically for him his idea of arriving at some truth statement, is informed by this kind of logical reasoning, but it's not chained to it in any serious sense. You can come upon logical conclusions uh, that don't match your intuitions in any way, and therefore you say, well, they must be untrue in some way, right? Um, and this is like a good spot of thinking about things like I think the philosopher Daniel Lacan says, if you come across a scientific study and it's done everything right, and at the same time you say, oh, this can't be true, he says, actually, what you should do is you should trust that intuition and say, even though they did all the right things, maybe they didn't arrive at truth in some way.
Yeah. Yeah, two examples that I think about a lot when I think about how this works is, one is Zeno's paradoxes.
Right.
It's very hard to like come up with like the logical argument for like what's wrong with the paradox of motion. The idea that, all right, well, you have to divide the motion, like you have to travel halfway there, then halfway again, and then halfway again, and you can never reach a point at which you reach your destination.
Yeah,
it's
because
very
you're
hard
doing
to come up.
splitting. You
Yeah,
can never actually get to from point A to point B, because it's
yeah,
to get from movement 1 to 2, you have to get to movement half, and to get to half, you have to get to half of half, and so on.
right, and logically very hard to come up with the argument that undermines the paradox of motion.
Yeah.
But everyone has this feeling upon hearing it, this is nonsense. Like, I know that motion exists. Like, you want to do the Samuel Johnson about Berkeley and idealism and just like kick the rock and go, I refute it thus.
Yeah.
And that's one thing that I think of. And the other thing I think about a lot in regards to this is ontological arguments. Because ontological arguments for the existence of God, I think, have this very unique status in which they are, once again, a lot of them are very logically consistent. They're tight. People normally are arguing about the premises and not the conclusions when it comes to the ontological arguments. But yet, even people who have like a deep belief in God often come away from an ontological argument and just go, I don't find that convincing at all. It just like, it doesn't feel right. Like, Bertrand Russell, of course, didn't believe in God. Felt like it was just like a trick of language. Like, there just had to be something fundamentally wrong with it. Like, almost everyone comes away from these arguments deeply unsatisfied.
And that fundamental discordance is oftentimes at conflict with our idea of what the informal inference is. And the informal versus the formal, where the formal is based off of, logical deductive truths, informal is your experience. It's that, well, I've seen this thing enough times in the world that I know that it's probably true. I know that X usually leads to Y. You can't show me that X leads to Z using your system, right?
Right.
This is where he's really converging with Bayes' theorem, which Bayes' theorem, very in vogue in cognitive science and many rationality circles, basically says that you can arrive at some, what they call a posterior distribution, or the probability of some truthfulness in the world, based off of sampling. You can see things happen enough times, and sampling them in your environment, that you assume that this pattern is therefore recreated. And so this kind of conflict between informal versus formal, it's not that he's necessarily fully discounting this formal inference, but he's saying that we do have very good reasons to also trust our informal inference, and this all comes mostly down to his ideas revolving around assent.
Yeah, I think one unfortunate thing about the structure of the book overall is that when he's doing the bulk of the discussion of inference, he actually doesn't give a very good positive case for why formal inference exists and what it does. That only comes later when he's discussing the illative sense, where he's saying, well, the illative sense can't be shared
Yeah.
between two persons. So what you have is instead formal inference, where the person tries to set down the set of propositions that led them to this conclusion. And sometimes that means you have to accept premises
Hmm.
from that person. But still you're able to share some of that internal knowledge acquisition through this act, which is putting it into formal inference and sharing in that mode.
Which is great because, he's separating what we do as acts of communication from how the mind, or even more fundamentally, how one can arrive at truth. He's saying in some way that this formal version of inference is a way of making this tacit, implicit thing explicit. It's the map, it's not the territory, and the idea, I'm trying to get you to where I, via some means of communication, which is what language is. A lot of philosophers who ended up in this postmodern turn, started doubting that philosophy can ever arrive at truth. And, I think if what they're operating on are these formal notions, they have something there. That doesn't mean that truth is not something out in the world. It means that truth is, to use Polanyi's term, personal knowledge. It's something that you arrive at personally. You can direct others to using these formal versions of inference, but they're really not the thing of itself. You arrive at truth statements via your own experience and guided by using these formal inferences, um, more or less to figure out where to look in some way.
Yeah. Yeah, most broad critiques of philosophy at some point are, I think they're actually critiquing the idea that you can arrive at all truth, not just via formal inference, but via inference
Inference in
at all.
general. Yeah.
Like inference is, like, Newman does not disparage inference at all. He in fact says it's a necessary part of arriving at any belief, is also be any real belief is being able to make inferences that lead you to that belief. But the idea that knowledge is reducible to these modes of inference is the issue. So the next form of acceptance that he talks about is this idea called credence.
Mm-hmm.
And credence is interesting because for him, it's what he calls it. It's a tentative acceptance. You don't have full conviction. It's the idea. It's like, oh, it's almost like sort of a ceteris paribus sort of the idea. Like, all else equal, like, I'll accept this for the time being. Or it's like you're in a foreign country that somehow you know nothing about, and you say, like, what city am I in? And the person goes, you're in Gurgleburg, and you're like, okay, like, I'm in Gurgleburg right now, like, I'll accept that, like, for like, you don't really have any sort of inference or assent to that opinion, but you're like, you're willing to give it credence. You're like, all right, I'll just move forward. Same sort of thing, like things
It's
that
notional.
yeah, the things that you read in the newspaper are generally things that you're, if you believe them at all, are things that you're giving credence to. You're like, well, I'll accept for, like, what I know, that this person is telling the truth and that this thing happened, and so on and so forth. What I think is important is the idea that, like, this is an important step in a lot of uh in arriving at assent. Like, you usually have to at some point give credence to various propositions and, like, try them out and try them on, like, what their weaknesses are, where they're going. And you can state things that you only have credence for, and, like, be honest in saying, like, oh, I believe this. And you can even not include the caveat that you believe it under these sorts of conditions. But go ahead.
So credence is interesting because it's kind of a class of these notional assents. Like he says, I assent that I'm an Orthodox Christian because I go to an Orthodox church, so on and so forth. And he calls it like a profession. I have like an opinion, which is again, like you were saying, I hold on the condition that someone tells me um, that this thing is true, right? It's like, oh, I'm sure tariffs are bad because they tend to do X, right? But if I were therefore shown that tariffs were, good in some way, uh, so on and so forth, I could change that matter of opinion. It's notional. It's this thing that is totally conditional on the statement of what it's around, which is very different from his concept of assent, which is I know this to be true because I hold it in a very different way than this conditional manner that I would hold a credence. There are a lot of things that I believe on credence in science, but those things can change. On the other hand, there are things that I don't hold in credence. I don't hold in credence that if I drop my pen, it's pulled down by the weight of gravity. Um, that's not something conditional in the same way that my credences or matters of opinion are. And really, what I think is uniquely human are these non-conditional assents, these things that I believe to be true. They can be changed, but they're built off of my experience, and in some way, I know them to be true. I assent to their veracity.
So the next category, I guess we should talk about assent at this
Mm-hmm.
point. And this idea of assent, which is you have full acceptance of this thing, like you don't really have any doubts about it. This is divided once again between notional and a real version of assent. But for Newman, the notional assent is like the assent to abstract propositions.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can assent to mathematical truths or something like that in this sense. And there are other things as well. I probably like things like social facts of places that you haven't experienced. Like you can accept that this is a social fact of this place, but like if you don't have lived experience of it, it's only going to be a notional assent. But then like real assent is these things for which we have like this real abiding life experience that's
Mm-hmm.
attached to the assent. So things like friendships, real religious conviction has real assent. And there might be other things that have real assent as well. Though it is funny that you brought up the example of gravitation, dropping your pin, because Newman does seem to have some doubts
Okay, I
about
don't remember that. Yeah.
about gravitation. No, it is one of the funnier parts of the book, and it is I think is really interesting, and it says a lot about Newman's cast of mind,
Mm-hmm.
where he says like he kind of seems to think that you're incapable of experiencing scientific fact, like even if it was proven to be a universal truth, like you can't actually experience scientific fact. And not only that, like he does go through this example where he talks about the law of falling bodies, and he's like, you can't prove that that law is invariable in its operation. You can only prove that it is probabilistically true, that every time you've dropped something, like you've seen it fall to the floor, but you can't. And he divides this like this idea is like, so yeah, between there's an idea of order and then there's an idea of truth. And for him, gravitation is only something about the order of nature. It not isn't necessarily truth or a law. And he says like the order of nature is not necessary but general in its manifestations. And it does lead to this thing where I do wonder if Newman himself like did not believe that any scientific propositions could actually be granted real assent. And I wanted to talk about this because I do think that there are at least some types of scientific propositions that at least come very, very close to being things that you can grant real assent to. And maybe you have something to say about this.
Well, I would say okay. Yeah, there is. I think one thing to be concluded about assent is that it's not necessarily something that's universal, right? So I can assent to gravity insofar as it affects my daily life or my own experience. I can assent that, this pen will fall. That doesn't necessarily mean that I therefore assent to uh, gravity as some general principle being a thing, right? Assent in this way is something that is very clearly personal, but isn't quite the same thing as what Popper might be talking about in terms of developing scientific truth statements. Uh, which might be very community based in some ways.
Yeah, when it comes to the idea of real assent, there's this line of C.S. Lewis's in The Weight of Glory, which I often think about when I'm thinking about like what it means to really assent to a big idea.
Mm-hmm.
And he says in this line, I'm gonna have to paraphrase because I don't have it in front of me. He's like, I believe that Christianity is true, like I believe that the sun is risen, not because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And I do think this is how
Yeah.
how big ideas are once you truly assent to them. So the example I want to use, which I think is going to resonate with you, is I think the theory of evolution in the sense of like there's common descent of all life on Earth that is developed through some form of natural selection over millions upon millions of years is the sort of scientific truth that you sort of can arrive at that sort of real assent to.
Mm-hmm.
Because you arrive at it through multiple forms of inference. You have the inference of the fossil record, you have the inference of comparative anatomy, you have the inference of the evidence of DNA. You have all these different ways to arrive at this same truth of how diversification of life happens.
Yeah, in of itself, it's like almost not a truth statement by itself, but it is a matter of fact about the world in some way, right?
Right. And it's like, and people disagree in all sorts of ways about what the mechanics of evolution are, or like, and or also what you can say about the past in certain senses. Like an example that I think about when it comes to this is like the fact that a lot of times when you're going through evolutionary logic, you kind of have to develop these just so stories.
Mm-hmm.
So you're like, why does this feature exist? And it's like you come up with this just so story, how like all the different transitional features that would have led to this feature could have all been useful.
Mm-hmm.
And those just so stories, like once again, like those aren't things that you can say are true.
Yeah, and they don't matter. Yeah.
Yeah. And like those just so stories, like you can be sucked into like very easily like giving them too much something more than credence
Mm-hmm.
when you shouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think about like I'm not saying that evolutionary psychology is useless or anything like that, but I'm saying like it's very clear in that field to me in particular that people develop these just so stories and then just run with them beyond what
Yeah.
that story actually can back up.
Which is great because it's something that puts, again, assent aside from inference.
Yeah.
I can have all these inference procedures, but they're almost separate from my assent of that thing. It's not that the assent is some overarching framework from which, um, therefore, deductive statements must be true, nor are they necessarily the total sum of a deductive statement, right? They're this, what Polanyi would have called an interpretive framework in some way, uh, that perhaps guide our reasoning, but aren't the process of reasoning systems themselves. They're they're kind of the, yeah. I mean, it's hard to put. It's hard to put.
Yeah.
One thing I really like that he brings up is he says, is an assent merely a conclusion, right? Is an assent just I've followed through on this thing enough times that I've seen that X leads to Y all the time. I'm therefore just concluding. And I love that he says, no, an assent is not a conclusion from your inference procedure. It's really something else. it's informed by inference procedures, it guides inference procedures, but truth is some other thing, right? He says that our assents oftentimes endure without any kind of inference. We believe things without necessarily being able to state what warrants them. He says even when assent fails and then they turn to assertions, we say, well, I used to believe that. I don't believe it anymore. He says, but the thing is like their force still remains, right? I can change my mind about a subject, but that previous truth is still informing the ways that I'm guided towards other things. And then he gets into even things like in mathematics, right? He says that when you have a logical procedure that leads to a conclusion, he says we can say that that conclusion is right, in which case the assent is automatic, or we might say, well, something's up in this case. I did something wrong. And he says, you're not assenting, even though maybe, even if you did something right, he's saying that you can still disregard what you've arrived at through this inference procedure and say, something's off here. Assent is doing something else for you than mere inference is giving you, and following mere inference through to its conclusion. Therefore, an assent is not a conclusion.
Yeah, an assent is some sort, like the way I've often thought about it is like an assent is some form of like mental act that brings you to this relationship with a proposition that is different than the relationship that you have with a conclusion.
Oh, that's
interesting. It is like the tool disappearing into the background.
Yeah.
For propositions.
Yeah.
And this was something that I wanted to talk about, and I was going to put it in a different place, but I think actually since we've gone down this road, now's the time to talk about it. One place where I thought that this book could be improved, and I realized that I had subtly improved it in my mind over the years since I had read it, was there's a lack of phenomenological analysis that goes on outside the mind. Book. There's a little bit of it. It's here and there. Like he talks about the faculties of sense, but he doesn't really go into great analysis of any sort of physical act or physical interaction. And I think there's like it would strengthen the case of the book if you had these as comparisons, because I think once you have this as a comparison, like once you have the tool use comparison, I think this starts to make a lot more sense. So I think there's a lot that Heidegger is wrong about, but I think that when he talks about his discussion of tool use with the distinction between like readiness to hand and presence at hand, I think is just true. There's a point at which tools are ready to hand and they disappear into the background. You're using your smartphone. You're not really thinking about the fact that there's a smartphone. You're not even thinking necessarily about the fact that you have an app, which is another tool within the tool. You're just sort of using the thing. You're navigating Twitter. You're checking your email. Like this is all seamless to you. And it's only when that tool fails in some fashion that it like becomes, its presence to hand becomes noticeable to you again. Like the fact that it's a mere tool like is recalled to your mind, and like that moment at which that's recalled to your mind is almost painful.
Yeah.
You do experience some sort of physical jolt when these things that were formerly seamless to you, if, for example, if you're excellent at a musical instrument, like that becomes seamless to you. Your interaction to it is no longer something that you're thinking about. And I think like once you have that comparison, which is a lot more grounded, everyone's experienced in some way, and you realize like, oh yeah, ideas are also tools. They're cognitive tools. That it shouldn't be surprising that ideas can also pass into this realm where they are no longer analyzed as ideas, but rather just intuitively accepted as truths.
I really like this point. I don't know what I have to add to it.
Yeah, to go back though to the question of scientific truth, like Newman also has like this really funny aside that he gives about causation, which I think is really interesting. Because he also distinguishes causation from the sense of natural order. Like causation, like, yeah, this like natural order is what we sort of like how we observe causation acting out normally in the world, but causation itself is something different. And he just sort of casually says in passing, he goes, well, we don't have any actual experience of any cause other than will. So if I have to ask the question, answer the question, what is it to alter the order of nature? I just apply that which willed it. It's like he's just seeing will everywhere in the world, like every act of causation for him. I mean, obviously for Newman, it's God, right?
Yeah.
It's the will of God that these things happen over and over and over again in some repetitive sequence. But I don't find that to be a convincing apologetic argument for the existence of God. But I do find the mere statement that actually it's willing is the only form of causation that we're really familiar with to be really interesting. Because it is hard to come up with an idea of like what sort of causation would we actually have any sort of internal experience of other than that of will. And that is also our first primary, I think, form of causation, is to know that like I will my hand to go reach out for something and then I can do that. And in some way, I do think that actually it's when you start to think about how people talk about causation, it does seem like there's this fundamental idea. There's some act of willing in causation.
I find this interesting. You said it's not convincing, and I don't find it convincing either. But this is something that seems to keep popping up, I feel like, in the history of Western philosophy. Descartes specifically says, the second half of Meditations is him being like, well, given all this stuff I said about how you can only know what you immediately know, how do we know that anything is true? And he says, well, I'm just going to assume that, God has a will in the world, and that this more or less you can, using inference procedures, uncover this will. David Bentley Hart, who has his own issues, in his new book, All Things Are Full of Gods, also gets into this, where he says, the simple thing about causation seems to be tied up through will, that this logical procedure that Y must happen because X also gives him some kind of apologetic reason for talking about the existence of God. And I don't know what I'm missing in that argument myself. I think I agree with you that we can think about it in terms of, or maybe I'm summarizing you wrong, we can think about it in terms of ways of primitive cognition or personal knowing pretty well, but it's something I'd really like to dissect more and understand more, at least in my personal relationship with that argument.
Yeah, I think the reason that it's unsatisfactory as an argument is actually that you can accept that that is a truth, and it doesn't necessarily lead to a theistic conclusion.
Yeah.
Because you definitely find this idea of willing being sort of like the fundamental aspect of reality in Buddhism as well. Like you don't need a sort of personal theism. Like you can arrive at it through some sort of like fundamental nature is like Buddha nature. Fundamental nature is like this other thing that is not necessarily a personal God, like the God of Christianity or Judaism, and still have this idea of causation being somehow rooted in the act of willing. And so that I think is why it becomes unsatisfactory. On some level, I think we're aware of more alternatives. And I think Newman himself wouldn't be surprised by this. Like there are places in which he does start to come out like and say things like, oh, well, we're aware now of like more opinions and we have to weigh these things in different ways. But for him, this is also a great thing because he also thinks that we also, the upside of where we are in our position of history is that more truths have been discovered, so we can build up and find even more truths now that we have these things. For him, this storehouse of truth that humanity has access to is something that's always growing.
Yeah, which is really the crux of his other book.
Yeah.
Development in Aid of a Christian Doctrine, right? Essay in Aid of the Development of Christian Doctrine. I'm looking at it now.
Yeah.
Since you somehow snuck Newman into my dissertation. Yeah, I mean, it is a weird thing that the logical procedures that happen in the world also mimic more or less the logical procedures that happen in mind. That might be that causation in that specific way is something that we either sneak in, right? We arrive at it just by seeing causality in the world. It might be that our inference procedures are causal based. They're built by causal mechanisms and therefore themselves have some kind of causality built into them. But as immature as the argument seems, it really seems like there's even more work to be done. Just thinking through that alone, it can't just be dismissed on its face.
Yeah, it is interesting too. Like, speak of the Buddhism case, like he does have this sense like that all ideas they don't exist in isolation. All ideas are dependent on other ideas. But they definitely don't for us. And like that goes down even to like the most fundamental level. Like he has this great line where he says, the mind is like a double mirror in which reflections of the self within self multiply themselves until they are undistinguishable, and the first reflection contains all the rest.
Jeez.
It's like when you start to dwell in on your inner experience, like you do find like this multiple reflection. Like you find you no longer find like a coherent self there.
There's no distinction.
Like, reflections.
Yeah. Wow, that's incredible. I mean, it just speaks to this work being not just amazing work of laying out cognition, but metacognition in some ways as well. Despite him not touching on the phenomenological.
I think what is interesting here, and like the way in which he approaches science, but also like the strength of this book in general, like does arrive out of like Newman being an extreme Jungian introvert. Like he's so attuned to the subjective experience of his own mind and of the world of ideas that he, there's some weakness of the objective and external reasoning in there, but I think that that's what leads him to be able to make all these like wonderful insights into how our minds operate with ideas. Like I think if he had been a different person, this would be a completely different book. He would be bogged down in these other things.
That's really an incredible kind of view of him, this skepticism of the objective, because it explains not just this book, but his other one on development as well, where he talks about ideas as organisms. He's not saying that they're, true and or false as they're constructed, right? But that there's these kind of community of thinkers that come together to build this thing through time. Treating the idea or ideas as phenomenology, as phenomenon of themselves, and not necessarily as truth. Truth is really something personally reflected in the individual more so than in the truth statement itself. I find that really, really extraordinary.
Yeah. This is an aspect of Newman where it's very interesting that like we've arrived at this place where Newman is now a doctor of the church in the Roman Catholic Church, because like in a lot of ways Newman is hard to position within the tradition. Even though like he became a Catholic, he even became one in almost an extreme sense, where he says in this book that like the infallibility of the church is the fundamental dogma of Roman Catholicism. It's not the existence of Christ or any of these other. It's actually the infallibility of the church, which is a pretty extreme statement. But at the same time, like, he's outside of the norms of traditional Catholic theology. Like, the idea of development does not jive with the idea that there's been nothing added to the apostolic deposit, or his skepticism of sort of rational formal inference also runs against a long Catholic tradition of the idea that the existence of God can be proven through formal means.
Wow. Yeah, it's totally anti-scholastic. Wow. Yeah.
And I mean, like, this is why, like, Newman is, within Christian theology, like, Newman is still very, very controversial. Like, it's hard from a historic perspective, which is why for historians of theology, Newman has been so influential to reject his ideas. But you come across people who just, like, they just can't accept it because it does run so counter to a lot of deep intuitions that actually practicing Christians have about the way the doctrine works. So, like, you do find these things, like the Orthodox academic Father Andrew Louth just goes, like, development, like, he sort of, like, just sort of stops at it. He's like, development, like, cannot be a category in Orthodox theology. It's sort of like, it's ruled out from the beginning.
Which is really interesting, because now thinking on it, it's almost as if Newman is more Orthodox than any other Catholic thinker than you can almost come up with, right? Because he's saying, what do our thinking systems grant us? Well, really, you have to arrive to the truth of something via personal means, right? It's not something that you necessarily deduce with logic statements, but that personal means has to be placed via some sort of tradition.
Yeah. Yeah, the other 19th century author that he ends up, like, kind of, synchronizing with is actually Dostoevsky. Because, like, when Dostoevsky talks about, like, his idea of religious experience entirely in this sort of, like, additive way, but, like, Dostoevsky was, like, much more a creature of the objective world. So for him, it's like, it's very, very sensate how he arrives at acceptance of Christianity. It, like, has this very carnal almost character to it. So from the point of view of how they interact with the world, they're very, very different men. But from the point of view of, like, how they think about the arrival to truth, like, they end up having this synchronization.
Yeah. One thing I really liked is when he's discussing the different forms of inference. We talked a little bit about the formal and informal, but he also talks about the natural. And his idea of the natural is something like perception, moral judgment. When I see something, I know it's false. I'm not saying, well, it's probably wrong to do X, Y, or Z, but I'm also, there's almost this virtue ethic or virtue epistemology that he sneaks in there with this, where he's like, eventually you'll end up being trained in such a way via the illative sense that this is something you develop, and you can figure out right from wrong in moral or non-moral circumstances pretty well. And you get to a point where you're not just viewing things in terms of their conditionals or decomposing problems in such ways, but he says what you're doing is you're judging wholes.
Yeah.
Like the entire gestalt of a thing versus just the parts that end up constructing it. And I tied this a lot in my reading to some of Peirce's ideas around abduction, where Peirce is like, abduction, where you come to form a hypothesis. You can do it very primitively, and some abductions are going to be bad, and to back them up with different kinds of inference. But on the other hand, you can develop these habits of mind where you'll just end up being a pretty good inference maker without being able to, or without necessarily having to back it up with deductive or even inductive logic per se. And Newman says this is like what judges do. Someone comes up on the stand The judge will be like, well, I can figure out that this person's lying, or I can figure out that this is the way that I should dispense with their case in certain ways without actually having to have formal written notions of why they're doing that thing. And I found that very very impactful in terms of thinking about the ways that humans, I guess you could say, reason in the wild. Um,
Yeah, and in that you also brought up, like, I think what is one of the other great themes of this book, which is the idea that human persons are developmental
mhm,
organisms, that
mhm.
we're constant, like, that actually the perfection of human beings is the capacity for improvement.
Yeah.
And for him, this is also what divides us from the animals. Like, you could say that maybe he's just wrong about this, but he does think that animals sort of are what they are from the moment they come into existence, and persons are not.
Mhm.
Like, whether or not that's true, like, definitely persons, like, that is a fundamental characteristic, is like this ability to advance and to know more truths and to exercise like better forms of judgment and so on.
Yeah, and I mean, this is just even more, I guess, primitively to his argument is, and this is something they discuss in philosophy of language all the time. Do we know that animals have beliefs or truth statements? Right? We can't even say that. You think about like an LLM or AI, right? Like we say, oh, the problem with AI or Chat GPT is that it doesn't know what it doesn't know, or it assumes that it knows things. I think, again, even more primitively, if we just ask, you know, does ChatGPT, when I'm talking, does it have beliefs?
Yeah.
Does it assent to anything? I think the answer is just a clear no. You can induce axioms into A, where then it can work via notions and say, based off of this notion, I know that this notion is true. But again, it doesn't have any form of real assent in the same way that we have it, that we hold truth statements in our minds.
Yeah. Yeah, and the great danger, especially with AI, the way that people interact with this, and we've seen this happen over and over and over again, is because they're a next token predictor.
Mm-hmm.
You can induce in the AI the responses
Yeah.
that it has beliefs and will and action and all these human characteristics just by having the conversation in such a way that it assumes that that's the appropriate response. And I mean, like, and see, I'm even doing it here. I'm saying like it is assuming rather than it is
Yeah,
just,
right, right.
yeah. It's so hard not to do this when you interact with these things, especially as sophisticated as they're becoming. Like, something that I actually do pretty regularly with AI is I like check in on them by wanting to discuss a book that I know really, really well. And I'll be able to tell when it's leaving things out or hallucinating parts of the book or things like that. And they are getting very, very sophisticated for any sort of old text. Like, they actually can be sometimes useful conversation partners. But you do come across these times when they start hallucinating things or like leaving things out. But because they're next token predictors, you can just go, I don't think this is true. This isn't part of the book. And then it'll go, oh yes, I'm sorry. And then like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
corrects from there on.
Yeah, I think you can gaslight your LLM into
Yeah.
notionally assenting that it's alive.
Yeah.
But I think until we can, construct one of these things, and we can't even right now, I mean, this is a big challenge. We can't even show this in animals,
Yeah.
that they have something akin to a real assent. We can't really pick up on it. One thing I wonder about is one thing I really, really appreciate about Newman's essay is that it was really a devastating attack in some ways on logic and the philosophy that would come to form
Yeah.
all of philosophy in the 20th century, right? Like he,
Yeah. He foresees the criticisms of logical positivism
yeah,
before it ever happens.
yeah,
And
exactly.
really before the rise of modern formal logic, I think that actually, like, some of the predecessors of modern formal logic are arising at
They're
around.
around, yeah.
I think Charles Dodgson, like Lewis Carroll's book on logic, which is from around the same time, like that in some ways is a predecessor of modern formal logic. Like I think that is around the same time, but he's definitely writing before Russell, like any of the like late 19th century, early 20th century figures who develop what we now think of modern symbolic logic.
Yeah.
I do think it's interesting, like since you brought up that idea of natural inference, which we should have discussed already, is that it is a type of inference for Newman. Like he's very, very aware of the fact that our faculties of like sense, sight, and things like this is like are not things that we actually necessarily give assent to. Mm-hmm. Like, you know, he says we are what we are and we use, but not trust our faculties. And those faculties are not just like the senses, but they're also our mental faculties. Yeah. And like for him, there's like this fundamental idea that just because we're fallible doesn't mean that reasoning is irrational or it's not this high act. He says like errors in reasoning are lessons and warnings, not to give up reasoning, but to reason with greater caution. It is absurd to break up the whole structure of our knowledge, which is the glory of the human intellect, because intellect is not infallible in its conclusions. And I do think that's an interesting point, because one of the flaws of philosophy is this idea that we can be infallible in our reasoning. It does come up as an assumption for certain thinkers. I don't think it's baked into the philosophical tradition. There are people who seem to think this way. Like, I definitely don't think this is true of Plato. I actually think that continually in the Platonic corpus, there's the idea introduced over and over again that reason is fallible. Mm-hmm. And this is something I wanted to talk about, was actually, I had this realization rereading this book for the first time in a number of years. That was actually when I read this book for the first time, which was back when I was like 18 or 19. That was the moment that I started to make my peace with the idea of Socratic perfectionism. So like Plato's Socrates seems to genuinely believe that if we know what the good is, we will do the good. Mm-hmm. And that errors in ethics are errors of knowledge. And there does seem to be like this simple objection to that. Like, you know, at least since Augustine, the idea it's like, oh yeah, I know what the good is, but instead I do the evil thing anyways. And like that does seem to be like part of our mental furniture. But when I start to think about it more, I think, well, no, that I don't actually know if that's true. I think that ethical propositions that we struggle with violating are actually like propositions that we either haven't given real assent to, or there's some lapse in our real assent to those propositions, that we actually think the good is for us is to do something other than act ethically in that situation. That we even, and this is something that's interesting too. It's because this actually strengthens Newman's argument about the existence of conscience itself as a proof for God. Like this is something that he goes into. Like the fact that there is like this immediate like reflection of conscience, like even though you've at some point like given up the idea that this is the good, like that you still have that reflection of conscience, like, oh, I just did a bad thing. Right. So it is curious, but yeah, I became much more, and like over the years, like rereading the Platonic corpus, I've just become much more open to the idea that, yeah, actually maybe Socrates is just right about this. And our ethical failures are just real failures of knowledge. Like if we really knew what the ethical truth was, we wouldn't do the wrong thing.
Yeah. That's fascinating. That actually our moral lapses or personal failures are oftentimes failures of inference.
Yeah.
Rather than they are to assent, right? I know that I did the wrong thing. I just came up for all kinds of good reasons for doing that wrong thing. I mean, which is kind of what we're taught oftentimes in Eastern Orthodoxy.
Yeah, and this sort of brings us to like maybe what is the big justification of the whole book, which is the idea of, does he sufficiently prove, and I think we can push away like the idea of, does he sufficiently prove that Christianity is rational, or does he sufficiently prove that Catholicism, belief in Catholicism, is rational? but whether or not he proves sufficiently that religious belief
Yeah.
as a general category is rational. Because something that people often come to is like, okay, you discuss what the theory of the essay is, and you go through it all step by step. And then they go, well, this just seems to like leave up almost everything to be a rational act. Like any form of assent is just rational. But I don't think that's true for Newman. Like I think he does. He says that assents can be tastes or opinions that don't necessarily come from the end of a rational act. We've just sort of like decided these feelings that we have are just like innate truths. I think it's kind of like,
professions and so on.
yeah, it's kind of the position that we sometimes have about works of art. Is that like we just believe that they are great and good, and that anyone, and like when you really believe that about a work of art, you start to think it's like almost like a moral failing in someone else if they don't recognize it as being great and good. There's this great line of A. Milne, who is the author of Winnie the Pooh, where he's talking about the wind in the willows, and he's like, the wind in the willows, like, you know, you don't get to judge the art of Kenneth Grahame, like the book judges you. An uncle will give it to his nephew, and upon his reaction to it, decide whether or not to keep him in the will. You know, there really is like something to these aesthetic assents that we give. Like they can be incredibly profound without any sort of act of reasoning behind them. But that isn't to say they're always irrational. Like some people could have a highly developed phronesis of aesthetics that actually leads them to aesthetic truths.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing this connects to is something that you and I spoke about privately, which is this question of like, is religious belief rational? Oftentimes people say, well, you know, and this is like a argument that we oftentimes dunk on, or we say it's immature, not well thought out. Say, well, you have faith in, like you were saying earlier, evolution.
Yeah.
It's like, well, yeah, actually, that's a pretty good argument. That I am more or less assenting to these things using the same cognitive, rational means.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually like something when I've tried to make the pitch for reading this book before to people, it's like actually it gives you it once you've read this book, you end up like in this bell curve meme where it's like you have faith in science, and then there's like the crying Wojak at the top at the 100 IQ Wojak who's just like, no, science isn't something you have faith in, and then the wise monk at 145 IQ, it's like science is something you believe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah, and
it is the same kind of something that's interesting about this too is it actually is the same sort of act in another way, because Newman talks, when he's talking about religious assent, he's like, well, to arrive at religious assent, you do have to grant sometimes certain, you do have to, not just sometimes, you have to grant certain presuppositions. And in some sense, only the people who feel some innate need for religion.
yes, right.
Newman does think that exists in everyone at some point, but you can become dead to it for various reasons. But it's only if you feel this innate need for religion that it actually causes you to go down the path where you're willing to conditionally accept or give credence to these propositions, try them out, try them on, and experience religion, and then arrive at some sort of actual religious assent. But that's also true about science. There are certain people, if you try to say, like, I'm going to try to convince you of the truth of evolution by common descent, it's just like not part of their mental furniture. Like they just don't care about that idea. Like they
it's
don't
not necessary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they don't feel any need to discover this. So nothing that you talk about is going to lead them to actually believe in it, because it just doesn't resonate with them on any sort of internal level.
Yeah. One thing that I like that you brought up is assent, or in some ways, and this is something that goes through Newman, I feel like on kind of a multi-scale level, both in terms of the individual developing towards truth, but also ideas as these, you know, collective organisms that bounce between minds, is developing between truth, is this idea of time and development in reaching understanding. It's not something that's for free in the world. It's something that you have to go out and search for. And I don't know, I almost feel like there's some beautiful theological, almost eschatological argument to be made there, that there's this kind of multi-scale property of humanity being human, or existing in a corpus of human ideas, um, that's like, actually, no, this thing's very hard. Coming to know things or arriving at truth is not some, and particularly I think in his context with God, is not something that generally for most people, or for any people, you arrive at for free.
Yeah.
Muscle that you have to develop. It's something you have to do. It's something that collectives have to do, right? It's true for any idea, but in particular, it's true for these deeper matters of faith.
Another interesting parallel that you see is people who develop sort of extreme beliefs around particular propositions. And often I think this comes from sort of doubt about the proposition itself, and you sort of like develop these, you state these other extreme things around the proposition to sort of defend yourself from giving up belief in the proposition. Right. So like some people who become, I think people do this about evolutionary biology. It's like in order to like protect the epistemic environment that like led them to believe in this, like they'll start saying like very, very extreme things, like to exclude other types of evidence from their worldview. And people do this with religion all the time. Is that they set up these like these structures around their religious beliefs where they are very clearly excluding other forms of reasoning, where they are very clearly like making extreme statements which could cause them to have to assess other claims. And to some extent, like Newman even says that this is a natural and maybe even sometimes a good thing, is that in order to keep our sense, we somehow have to protect ourselves from overanalyzing them at times. And some people I think are particularly sensitive to this. Like some people can go back, analyze a belief, and then go back to assenting to it very quickly. And for other people, that's incredibly painful. And that I think does lead people to these sort of like extreme rigorous structures sometimes around belief. It's both rooted in form of doubt, and it's also rooted in the idea that like revisiting your acts of inference or entertaining other ideas actually becomes like some sort of like that pain that you feel when the tool that was ready to hand becomes present at hand again. Like that pain when it comes to the ideas, making that trans is too great for you.
This is really interesting because it connects with ideas related to like epistemic virtue, right? You can assent to things via non-rational means, and you can do all kinds of sneaky tricks to basically shield your assent from rational inference and so on and so forth. But does that really mean that you've cultivated the right kind of mind for gathering assents? Have you figured out this, Peircean ethic in a way, habits of mind that are really helpful for your system?
Yeah. And for like, this is where it's important, I think, to like bring back, and like Newman doesn't quite do that, to bring back that idea that the illative sense is just like a mode of Aristotelian phronesis, because like that has to be continually exercised. Yeah. It is not something that like you fine tune once and just like let go. It is like something that you have to repeatedly do in order to maintain it. And it does seem like our capacity to recognize truth is something like that. Is that like if you aren't constantly trying to exercise your ability to recognize truths, like that sense in some way becomes degraded.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And this actually brings up another interesting part of the book where he actually foresees a lot of problems, like common complaints we have about the modern information environment. Mm-hmm. Like he's already feeling those pressures in the 19th century. Like he's like, in this day, the subject matter of thought and belief has so increased upon us that a far higher mental formation is required than was necessary in times past. and higher than we have actually reached. The whole world is brought to our doors every morning. And he says, now you have to like arrive to conclusions about things you see in the news, like all these different social ideas. Like you've got Marxism, you've got Fabian socialism, you've got capitalism, you've got all these great ideas like constantly being imposed upon you, these political principles, practical measures that you might have to vote on. It's like we have to form our opinion, make our profession, take our side on 100 matters on which we have but little right to speak at all. But we do speak and must speak upon them, though neither we nor those who hear us are well able to determine what the real position of our intellect is relatively to these many questions. And it is interesting because it brings up this thing that he doesn't come to this conclusion, but there might actually be a real downside to this information environment and to the production of human knowledge, where actually like the pressures that we're put under to constantly exercise our judgment and our illative sense on various propositions actually becomes like too much for people to bear. And so they do start to shut down that truth-seeking impulse in favor of some sort of fundamentalism of some sort or another, to like shut off like that constant stress of having to exercise this faculty over and over and over again.
You give the faculty up and then you start relying simple heuristics or very easy, informal, or formal versions of inference to arrive at your conclusions, rather than really trying to build any kind of truthful apprehension of what's in front of you.
Yeah. You do like sit there and you just go, oh, I can't think about this. And then rather than like, there's sort of two different positions you could take to this. You might just like bracket away and go like, okay, like I just don't know what's true here and I'm not going to think about it. And I'm going to put the action on something else. And then there's the idea that like, no, like I just sort of like become so stressed that I shut down a lot of my mental faculties altogether and just instead rely on like some sort of dogmatic assertion.
Yeah. Which is, not to like know true Scots certain things, but I think oftentimes when people have their beliefs or belief statements, things that they would state are their assents are like not in fact actually assents. Like,
yes,
you think about the whole QAnon phenomenon, right? I think oftentimes what people are signaling by those beliefs is, oh, this would suck if it were true. I trust these people around me. I don't think that what really matters for them is the truthfulness of the statement, or even that they are necessarily assenting to it. But what they're doing in some ways, they're withholding assent and letting all these other faculties run wild to run any of their decision-making procedures.
Yeah, we also hear about like the idea like, oh yeah, some people are just engaging in vibes-based decision making about like what's true. It's like it actually isn't what's true anymore. It's just like what like feels like it's going to get the best reaction.
Right.
And that also happens on the level of personality, like the idea of audience capture for people who in some way are putting their real personality out there on the internet constantly, and then they actually begin to reduce their personality to that which is the parts of their personality that the audience responds to.
Right. Yeah, in some ways we end up becoming these archetypes or figures out of convenience rather than from like a deeper exploration of the generating mechanisms of our behaviors or who we are, right?
And so what I would say is like, I think that Newman is correct that like religious belief can be rational, and just because like there's difference of religious belief like, doesn't make it a non-rational act. Like this is a common idea. It's like, oh, well, there's all this diversity of opinion, but there's also diversity of opinion on everything else. It's just like we've somehow like elevated certain epistemic processes above others. And like we've said, oh, if you failed on these ones, you're just like absolutely wrong. And we shouldn't give any credence to what you say. But like we ignore these other processes that obviously lead people to truths and lead them to truths every single day.
Right. Yeah.
So to me, it's like, I don't think that Newman proves too much, even though like when I do think about this book in an abstract manner, like I can understand how someone would come away with that feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Because it is something, it can be something disturbing, especially if you've really internalized certain ideas about how we arrive at truth. Like the person who's like really internalized, oh yeah, like all truth apprehension is either logical or Bayesian,
Mm-hmm.
like is not going to come away like feeling entirely reassured in reading this book. The utilitarian who believes that like ethical reasoning can be reduced to some sort of like cost benefit analysis,
Right.
not going to is not going to come away like feeling like this book actually represents rationality, and they're going to say, well, this proves too much.
Yeah, but yet he offers, kind of the critiques that I think all those people struggle with in all
Yeah,
these different frameworks, right? Like he closes the gap between Bayesian inference and the ability to actually hold solid belief. He closes the gap between when people calculate out their utilitarian calculation. They say, "Well, this doesn't seem right." Right? He's like, "Well, yeah, because what you're
yeah,
speaking to is your actual assent, and it's telling you your inference procedure is misaligned." Or has missed something in what you actually believe. Like what you're actually holding to be true is not what you've deduced via these logical statements. It's something else, and you're using these logical statements to get at it, or in some ways help support it. But that's not actually the thing that you're assenting to. And so, yeah, I mean, it would cause a lot of trouble in people. But if you do consider that, the mind works like this, and I see it as a feature rather than a bug, you know, I don't know where I was going with that, but yeah.
right. I mean, well, that is what Newman is proposing, though, is that it is these things are all features, like they are how we arrive at. Because what he does is he actually gives an explanation of like how we arrive at both everyday beliefs and at sort of like complex synthetic beliefs as well. Like he puts these all on a continuum where they can all be understood. There's no disjunct. And often when you try to reduce epistemology to like some smaller subset of mental acts, like you
Yeah.
end up like carving these joints where there's no real connection between like how do I know that I'm touching the computer versus how do I know that iron has this particular atomic structure, or 1 + 1 = 2.
Right. Right. Yeah. He's acknowledging that gap.
Yeah.
And he's saying,
Well,
nevertheless,
I don't think he's just acknowledging it. He actually creates like a whole system in which there is different layers which actually close these gaps. Like
right. Right.
there's actually some continuous form, and it's all leading to this form of assent. But there are all these like different ways in which we try on propositions,
Mm-hmm.
accept things along the way to that
Yeah. Yeah.
conclusion.
Yeah. I find that wonderful. It makes me wonder, like, why is it that so many philosophers or people who think in this space seem to avoid the fact that we actually do arrive at conclusions, that actually we do assent to things, right? It doesn't seem to me that assent is something that um, is really treated analytically so well in different sorts of epistemic systems. And um, it seems to me part of the reason may be precisely because many of our assents, the reasons that we hold them, are inarticulable. They aren't mere acts of communication, but nevertheless, they are very much real.
So I think at this point, we're probably ready to wrap up. And since I gave this sort of initial case for why you would want to read this in the first place, I'll let Cody provide, a closing argument now that you've heard this discussion about why you might still want to read this book and other things that are going on.
Yeah, I think a big takeaway from me in this book, at least situating it in terms of things that are happening in cognitive science or, uh, really big dilemmas that have lorded over philosophy over the last 120 years, is what Newman is doing here is he's giving almost a phylogeny or a taxonomy of thought. He's saying, these are the processes that we might call cognition. We do X, Y, but in particular, what he does is he calls this difference between the processes or procedures of thought and that of conclusion and belief, which is this massive gap that I think it's either assumed, it's hidden away, it just simply is not addressed or taken seriously. And one of the reasons why may be because what's really happening in thought in many of these ways is not something that's easily articulable. That, to go back to Descartes, our knowledge formation processes are all we know. They're very personal. It might come down to, some of the hard problems of consciousness, saying, how do I know that someone else thinks something else? How is it that I hold a belief might be something as foreign to us as the means by which we understand our own thinking, which itself is, again, very much based on memory or very much based on logical inference. And I think that to take a cognitive science of the human very seriously, these are questions that are going to have to be dealt with in the future that Newman, I think, outlines really, really well. But there's this higher order ecology of thought separating our sense from these processual things that we do. And that in itself, I think, is really worthy of exploration. And I think, should everyone read this book? I think that there should be like 100-page version of this that keeps some of his best quotes. But otherwise, yeah, I really look forward to relying on this, at least, in my own work in the future, and in particular with a lot of Newman's other writings on the development of thought in general.
Yeah. I don't have much to add to that except for the line about maybe there needs to be a 100-page version of this. Is like, I do think that this is a book that's been under responded to, and in some ways like a good response or a good concise version of this that also adds on some insights that have happened over the course of the last century and roughly a half since it was written would be really useful. So I hope that it is something that like you continue to engage with like in your scholarly work, because I do think that there's a lot going on here, and maybe hopefully it will lead to people like producing more concise versions of these theses in the future.
It's very funny. I think just as a preview of like future podcast episodes, when you said that you read this when you were 18 or 19, I was like, one, I totally believe that is totally true. It really explains you a lot as a person. Because this was a tough read for me, but very worthwhile, and it's it's worth the effort and the work. So,
well, I mean, I don't know if I understood it that well at 18 or 19. Like, I think I took away a lot of core ideas from it at that time, but like, I really good at applying those ideas. And I think like I did, like, even without rereading it, I think this is something that does happen with great books, is you can read a great thinker, get about like maybe a third of what they're saying or even less, but like those ideas are so worth mulling over and like become part of your mental furniture. I do think like that is something that I want to do with this podcast in the future, is like, even if it doesn't inspire people to go and read these books, like maybe like these condensed versions of them, these discussions, like just add things to people's mental furniture that they're able to revisit, process, like go through, digest.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Do you know what are some other books that you think you might end up covering?
So we talked about discussing Polanyi. I think discussing personal knowledge is definitely like a potential good follow-up to this, because there is this sympathy between them as thinkers. There are some other possibly like other theological works that I think are worth discussing, because they have great ideas in them that people like might not be familiar with. Like we've talked before about Maximus Confessor's Ambiguum 8. I do think like that's an interesting thing, because oftentimes people who are from Western society, they sort of think they already know what the Christian worldview is, even if they're not particularly religious. And they'll go seek out, like, okay, what is the Hindu worldview on this particular topic? Like, what do like various schools of Buddhism like think about this? But like, they don't actually go, oh, there's actually a diversity of opinion among Christian thought about like sort of fundamental metaphysical issues or things like this, and they don't address that. So I do think like revisiting some of these like more deeply like metaphysical or like takes on like what the nature of human beings are, not just from the Christian tradition. I think also it's worth visiting from other theological traditions as well. Like I don't think that for me, there's no clean cleavage between theology and philosophy, and they're like or religious thought in general. In philosophy, it's very hard for me to divide these things, and it's sometimes even hard for me, despite that being the ancient quarrel, for me to like always divide poetry from philosophy either, because I do think like there are ways in which, and this wouldn't be surprising to Newman, I think that there are certain truths that get communicated better through these aesthetic forms than necessarily through these formal inference forms that philosophy has.
Right. One thing that I'm really excited about, not to get us further into the weeds when we're concluding, but is that, there's this big, huge emphasis lately, at least in my discipline of cognitive science, on different kinds of Buddhist philosophies of thought and process ontologies and things. And for me, this Catholic Orthodox tradition is very rich. I mean, I've gotten into Newman, Polanyi, Joseph Ratzinger, all these other guys that I'm like, oh my gosh, like if we could just integrate this back into our current philosophy of mind, it'd be that much richer. So I'm really excited to talk about, some of these books and thinkers in the coming months.
Yeah. So anyways, that wraps up what's the first episode of the Horizons Review. Hopefully I'll have another episode out in 2 or 3 weeks with another guest, and Cody will be back next month, and we'll move on for there. But if you're here, thanks for listening.